Back in the 1940s, an editor at the Wall Street Journal started requiring his writers to include a very specific paragraph up high in their stories to explain exactly what those stories are all about. This style has spread to many other publications. It's not required by any stretch, but it's a good habit to have in reporting and writing, especially when you're trying to find your voice as a writer. This is a nut graph, this paragraph. It's the graph that tells us as readers what the story is about and why it's important. It situates us and it sells us on the story. Remember, you've got to convince someone to read your story all the way through, and to a large extent, the nut graph is your best and last chance to do it. The nut graph often expands on the headline, and in many ways it can be more important than the lead. Chip Scanlon at the Poynter Institute defines a nut graph this way. It justifies the story by telling readers why they should care. It provides a transition from the lead and explains the lead and its connection to the rest of the story. It often tells readers why the story is timely, and it often includes supporting material that helps readers see why the story is important. I would also add that the nut graph signals to the audience whether it's the right audience for that story. For example, I'm not interested in nail polish, but a nut graph will tell me if the story is aimed primarily at ninja nail polish appliers who would really be interested in the gritty details, so to speak, or if it's telling a more general audience like me something that I might actually be interested to learn about trends in nail polish that I could talk about with my wife or my daughter. Sometimes it's not just one paragraph, it's part of a graph or a couple of graphs. But I want you all to focus on writing a clear, concise paragraph that accomplishes these goals in your own stories. The nut graph generally goes right after the lead. The other great thing is it frees you up to try a bunch of different kinds of leads. The lead could be an image or a description, and we'll talk about leads later. But the most important reason to have a nut graph is that it focuses you on what your story is about and what details you need to support your basic contention for the story. The first thing that you should write after you've gathered all your research, all your interviews, everything else that you need is the nut, what I would call the working nut graph. It might not be the actual nut graph that you end up with in the story, but a paragraph that tells you as the writer what the story is about will help keep you on track. By the way, a graph is a short way of saying a paragraph. I'm just old enough to know a lot of the old newspaper slang that doesn't really apply anymore, but I still use it. So let's look at a few examples. This is a story from the New York Times a few years ago. If it'll ever come up, we will see... Come on. Here we go. We see a headline about tech startups find a home on the prairie. Nice little allusion to Little House on the Prairie there. We see a photo of some techie-looking people. Then we have a lead about this guy, Ben Milne, and his eventual success story with his app. But then, this is called an anecdotal lead. But then again, leads are for another video. But here we get down to this paragraph right here. We got it back on here. From Des Moines to Omaha to Kansas City, a region known more for its barns than its bandwidth, a startup tech scene is burgeoning. Dozens of new ventures are laying roots each year, investors are committing hundreds of millions of dollars to them, and state governments are teaming up with private organizations to promote the growing tech community. They are calling it, what else? The Silicon Prairie. This is a typical New York Times nut graph. It says that in an unexpected place, tech companies are flourishing. It would be of interest to people who want to start tech companies, to people who want to invest in tech companies, and people who would like to incubate startups in state government or other places. It has a cute tagline. You can imagine people saying, hey, did you see the Silicon Prairie story in the Times today? And it has some typical Times snark about the flyover zone in the middle of the country. Here's another example, also from the Times. So the headline is mostly white forces and mostly black towns. And then we have a lead paragraph that's very descriptive. The population of Maple Heights has gone from nearly all white to two-thirds black, but its police-defined fire departments have not kept pace. The Maple Heights police force today still has only 2 black officers out of 35, and the fire department is 100% white. Now, normally we wouldn't care about the mayor of Maple Heights, Ohio, or the hiring practices for his public service units, but then we get to this nut graph. Maple Heights is far from unique. Across the country, police departments still struggle to hire and retain minority candidates, but the problem has new relevance since the fatal shooting of a young black man last month in Ferguson, Missouri, where just 4 of the 53 police officers are black, according to the chief. So here we see why the story should care. We've transitioned from the lead. It tells us why the story is timely, and it signals to the audience that this is something of national concern. So it really works. Here's one last example. This one is from Vogue. So composer Nico Muhly brings the internet age to life. He's everywhere. He composed a score. He wrote incidental music, contributing music, blah, blah, blah. We get a nice scene about a subterranean rehearsal room in this great place, and there's a staff chorus and a handful of principal singers, and blah, blah, blah. He's giving them instructions and a summary of this. So this is a lead that's sort of all over the place. But then we get this nut graph. In a time when the New York City Opera was forced to shut its doors in bankruptcy, Muhly is a welcome symbol of the survival of classical music, though he avoids speaking of his work on those terms. I can't make people come, he shrugs. All I can do is be 32 and writing music. You know what I mean? So this is a nut graph that's just part of a graph, but still it works. It explains that maybe he is the great whatever hope of classical music in New York City. So it works pretty well. We'll be practicing nut graphs in class, but what I want you to do before class, due by 11:59 is always the night before, is to go out and find a good feature story, maybe something related to your beat. Write a blog post about it, linking to it of course, but paste in a copy of the nut graph as an inline quotation. Then I'd like you to write a blog post that explains whether the nut graph succeeds in making the story timely, whether it makes it relevant, makes it important, whether it succeeds or not, and most importantly, what audience it's aiming for. As always, ask any questions you might have, and we will discuss this more in class.